authority be given to the leadership of both parties to call up bills for you which have previously been cleared by way of unanimous consent, or to bring up information, or to use the time other than for just sitting around while the attendants in the gallery explain to the visitors why there's nobody on the floor. The trouble is, too, in enforcement of changes, and I agree that we have a tripartite or triangular system. I think we have one level of committees too high, whether it be the appropriations or the authorization or the budget, in that specific case, but we have too many. The Rules Committee of the Senate, among other things, does do a little more than the broom closet work, because every other committee has to justify its annual budget expenditure, proposed expenditure, to the Rules Committee. And generally speaking, it has to be admitted that senators who come there as chairman or ranking members before the Rules Committee and ask for more money, most of the time, not always, most of the time ask for more staff. Every time they appear annually, they ask for more expenditures, they want more committee rooms, while at the same time they are complaining about the waste of the taxpayers' money and the waste of the taxpayers' time, and that the government bureaucracy is too big, while they themselves are busy expanding that very government. As to generally accomplish something, to getting something accomplished, perhaps the old French maxim applies, tant pis, tant mieux. The worse it gets, the better it gets. Matters have gotten so bad in the past, for example, a few years ago, where Social Security structural changes could not be made if they became political. Both parties agreed on a truce, and each party agreed to hold off any criticism of the other, and the adjustments were made. The same thing happened to the federal increase in the gasoline tax. If either party had made a political issue of that, you'd never have gotten it. They had to get together and say, boys, let's don't fight. We'll agree not to blame each other, and they got through the thing in maybe 72 hours. So they can work when they really want to work. But the main problem, as I say, is the Senate doesn't keep its own promises to itself.
Thank you very much, Senator Scott. Senator Thurmond, do you have a comment?
I just want to mention one thing. It's been, we talked about money, and that is the thing that takes more time than anything else. I think we could abolish the Budget Committee. And if we don't do that, then we ought to combine the appropriations and authorizing committees, because they do essentially the same work. It's just duplication. A lot of time could be saved if we do one or the other. The other thing I want to mention is I'm convinced the staff should be reduced. When I became chairman of the Judiciary Committee in 1981, I cut off 67 or 69 members at one clip, saved $1 million. Judiciary Committee alone. I'm convinced the staff could be reduced to at least 10% or maybe 20% throughout the whole Congress. Well, this may not save so much money, may be considered pittance, but at the same time, I think it would produce more efficiency. It would trim down and get more done. There's too much feeling around here about getting patronage, and one reason is to help get reelected. I don't think the people are obligated to help a man get reelected by spending the people's taxpayers' money.
First, a statistical clarification, but one that has substance. Senator Mattingly hinted that campaign costs really sort of just rose with the Consumer Price Index, and that's why they seem so high, just so you have the figure. The CPI rose between 1974 and 1986, it doubled, or a little more than doubled. Campaign costs have increased 1974, 1986, 12 times. They've gone up like a skyrocket. It hasn't been just a gradual oozing increase along with, say, a 3 or 4% inflation rate in recent years. It is a skyrocket cost. When I ran for the Senate in Missouri in 1980, I raised and spent $1.3 million. The Democratic nominee to succeed me in Missouri in 1986 spent $4.5 million, and the Republican nominee, the victor, spent $6 million plus. We all know the Helms-Hunt race of 1984, insofar as spending is concerned, the most notorious race in American history. $26 million spent together by Senator Helms and Governor Hunt. Now, Senator Andrews mentioned he was in favor of the legitimate filibuster. Like beauty being in the eye of the beholder, the filibuster is in the eye of the speaker. If it's something you're interested in and like, it's a legitimate filibuster. If it's something that you think is boring and a waste of time, it's an illegitimate filibuster. I echo and join with Senator Thurmond that when you get 60 votes, unlike Yogi Berra, it's over. When it's over, it's over. The British have what is called the guillotine. When they get their equivalent of 60 votes, the guillotine comes down and debate ends. And I'd be willing, as Senator Thurmond said, to add an hour or 2 or 3, whatever it is, for a wind-up. But when it's over, it's over. Now a word on the 2-year budget cycle. That's not as neat and simple as it might seem at first blush. You could appropriate, indeed, for 2 years, but there will always be a multitude of, quote, unforeseen circumstances, unforeseen emergencies. For instance, Challenger. Suppose you'd appropriated a 2-year budget cycle for NASA and Challenger goes down. You'd have to have an emergency appropriation the next year. Agriculture, as far as the eye can see, will always need an annual emergency appropriation, regardless of whether you have a 2-year cycle. The parks get into trouble, the national park system. More people show up at Yosemite than we're expecting. Takes more people to police it and clean it up. They'll have an emergency appropriation. So it isn't just as simple and neat as if to say 2 years and it's done with. Believe me, there would be a multiplicity of reopenings in the budget in the second year. Both Senator Andrews and Senator Mattingly urge doing away with the Budget Committee. I would, if I were here, think about it. But let me tell you what one of the consequences would be if we did. Because I was here in the Senate in the days preceding the creation of the Budget Committee. Budget Committee came in, as Senator Mattingly properly points out, in 1974. I came here in 68. Here's how we did it in 68 to 74, before we had a Budget Committee. We'd have a series of appropriation bills. We'd start with the District of Columbia one. No one fought much about that. We'd come along with military construction, not too huge a fight usually about that. Then we'd come along with transportation. That was usually gentle, fairly gentle. And we'd come along with interior, and that, you know, there wasn't much Mount Vesuvius action in there. But then as we got down the line to the end of the year, and the clock was ticking, it was 1 minute to midnight, we'd get hit with what we call the HEW bill, now called HHS, all of the social programs, and last but by no means least, the defense bill. And then, after we'd passed those 2 bills, somebody would say, hey, total up what we spent. And somebody had one of those little calculators, go pocket a queef, pocket a queef. My God, we've spent $1 trillion, or whatever we spent. And that's how we budgeted by appropriation. We ran the total, we ran the tab at the end of the year. The way maybe people run their tabs on their expense accounts and total it all up in December and see what they spent for entertainment expense for the year, so they can take it as an ordinary necessary deduction. We ran the tab at the end. It was a free, open, uncontrolled, sort of a free spirit type of process. Do we want to go back to that? I ask. I admit, as I said in my opening remarks, the budget process is imperfect. It needs much more work. It is not the Senate's proudest hour. But I wonder, do we just put a big X through it and go back to what it was before? Another point, it was mentioned by someone, I forget whom, that the use of these cameras is going to control the filibusters. The very fact that these cameras are on us is going to sort of keep us under control because we won't look too good on these cameras, you know. So doesn't control. Classic example. End of the session, not picking, I mean, I could cite any case. It's Senator D'Amato. I love Senator D'Amato. He is one of the ablest politicians I know, and the vote return in New York proves that. We're at the end of the session. We're trying to pass the continuing resolution. The clock is about to expire. Workers are going to be laid off because we haven't passed the continuing resolution, and Senator D'Amato's up talking for days on a training aircraft that no one in America wanted except Senator D'Amato and the New York congressional delegation. The president thought it was a silly training aircraft. The Defense Department thought it was a silly training aircraft. Senator Goldwater thought it was the most stupid training aircraft he'd ever heard of and said it in his usual blunt manner. Senator D'Amato wanted it. So he conducted one of these filibusters. If Senator Andrews were here, I'd have to ask him, was that a legitimate filibuster or an illegitimate filibuster? To me, it was an illegitimate filibuster and should have been guillotined down when we got 60 senators to sign a sheet of paper and said, okay, that's enough. Senator D'Amato, sit down. We're going on to the next order of business, namely the functioning of this government. All right. That's around Robin Hood's barn to get to Maury's question. Committees. I think at the peak of my great power here, I was on 17 committees and subcommittees. I think I topped my friend Mattingly by 2 or 3 or 4. We like to have a lot of subcommittees because that gives us staff. Staff gives you clout, we think. And so we are spread horribly thin. I remember one day, we just ran a check. One day, 5 of those 17 subcommittees were meeting at the very same hour. 5. So obviously, I could at best go to 1. And so staff would cover the other 4, or it would be totally uncovered, as was true in many instances, because some of them are very boring. But you can't always tell that in advance. But we are spread too thin. I think, for instance, Mac, and maybe Hugh would agree, that if you got on the Finance Committee, which I think is the power committee of the United States Senate, if I were reincarnated and we're coming back here, I would seek to get on finance. That's where the action is, now and in the future. If you got on finance, that committee is so busy, that's the only committee you ought to be on. I mean, if you want on finance, it does taxes, it does trade, it does Medicare, it does Social Security, et cetera. If you want on that, and as important as that is in that wide array of legislative jurisdictions, you ought to function on that and focus on that. And you ought to be on nothing else. And maybe I'd have that committee, maybe be a 9-member committee. I don't know how I'd work my numbers out, but appropriations can be a full-time job. Mac and I both have served on that. That can be a full-time job. Appropriations, how many members we got on that? 30? 29. 29 members sit on the Appropriations Committee. It's a coveted assignment. You can do a lot of goodies for your state. You can get a road, a post office, a museum, a zoo, and senators like that. So 29 of us, that's an unwieldy number. Gross, I mean, half would be, 15 would be plenty for that committee, but you ought to focus on that. I thoroughly agree. Senator Mattingly did yeoman work in his committee on committees. We do have a comparable thing on the Democratic side called the Steering Committee, but it was Senator Mattingly who took the lead on this to try to downsize this place. And he got some accomplished. He sort of held the floodgates. He didn't get nearly as much accomplished as in his mind and his heart as he wanted, because you were stepping on toes. Stepping on toes of senators who were on these committees, had staff that they wanted to protect, et cetera, et cetera. And I admire Mac for having done the work that he did. At least it constrained the explosive growth. And I think if you asked every member of the Senate and whispered in his ear a private vote, are there too many committees? Are we spread too thin? It'd be unanimous. I can't think of one senator. No, I can think of one, and he'll be nameless. You know what I mean? Except one senator. The 99 others would say, yeah, we're spread too thin.
It's very good. Yes, Senator Mattingly.
Good. Addressing going back to the filibuster, comment about filibuster, and I think you're exactly right, Senator Eagleton, say it's really in the eyes of the beholder, and I recall the debate on the T-46 aircraft. But also at that same time, toward the end of the session, I recall we sort of did it off the floor of the United States Senate, the debate about whether we're going to have a filibuster, because there was a threat of a filibuster on the death penalty, as you recall.
Yes, true.
By Senator Levin and Senator Kennedy and others that did
Correct.
not want that in the drug legislation.
That's very important. It's not only the actual filibuster that you hear and see on C-SPAN, it's the threatened filibuster.
It's the threatened filibuster that really holds it up.
Yeah.
And if y'all have not fallen asleep yet, that back when I first started talking about some of the things, the great things that did happen this year in reference to judges and contra aid and South Africa, but the issue, the debating of the issue on contra aid and on South Africa was worked out by 8 people. I happen to be one of them, with Senator Dole, Senator Byrd, and Senator Kennedy and others, to try to negotiate a time agreement on the floor of the United States Senate where those could be debated and finally get to a vote. And we did work it out, but it took 10 days off the floor of the United States Senate to work out a time agreement for roughly 5 days of a debate on the floor of the U.S. Senate. So, and one other thing, in reference to the 2-year budget cycle, I think whether or not it's better than the current 1 year is I think that's sort of the question. Would we be better off? Would it be an improvement over the 1 year? And probably neither of them are going to be perfect. But we will always have what they term supplemental appropriation. That means there's always going to be something come along that you have to appropriate additional monies for. But over the larger scope of a $1 trillion budget, you could probably, over a 2-year budget cycle, really accomplish more and lay, maybe if you laid 75% of it aside by having a 2-year budget cycle, at least you would resolve a lot of the dilemma that the Congress gets in. And I would just sort of, you were talking about this place here, right here. My first 2 years in the United States Senate, the last 4 years was spent as being chairman of the military construction on appropriation, but the first 2 years I was chairman of the legislative branch. Now, when I got legislative branch, I wasn't quite sure what that was when I first got in here in January of 1981, but what it was the funding of Capitol Hill. I never knew I had so many friends. That obviously well, you may know or not know, but I'm a very strong fiscal conservative. And the first year, 1981, I cut 10%, reduced the legislative branch budget in the Senate by 10%. I made a lot of enemies. 99 senators and all the staff, and everybody got mad. And the second year, I just froze it at that current level. But that probably, you'd be surprised how much money, I'm not certain what it is now, about $1.6 billion is what funds Capitol Hill. That's a lot of money. For a guy from South Georgia, I still think that's a lot of money, $1.6 billion. But we see what has sort of grown out, and this will get into your issue about spending for campaigns. The Hart Building, which is right behind us, right around here somewhere, this last edifice that we just built up here, cost $137 million to build it. That happened before I ever came here. I live in it right now, be moving out shortly. But this past 12 months, this Congress spent $144 million just sending out mail. And it wasn't all because of the letters you wrote in. The letters you wrote in to the Congress, and which we respond to, whether you're talking about taxes or your Social Security or whatever it may be, whatever issue, only amounted to roughly 10% of that money. The rest of that $144 million was self-generated mail. What do I mean by that? That means when Senator Scott over here decides he wants to send out a newsletter to his people in his state, that costs a lot of money to send that out. I sent out one when I first got elected up here, and then I found out how much it costs. And I said I was never going to send out another one. Now, I live in Georgia. It'd probably been politically better off for me to do that. But roughly, in other words, $130 million of that is self-generated mail that comes out of this place, which is nothing more than political advertising. I think that's a downer. I'm just not for that. I think, roughly I've got in 1.6 million pieces of mail just in my office in 6 years, of which we responded to them. That's quite a bit of communication right there. But just think what it would have been if I'd been ginning up newsletters going back and forth to my constituents all the time, and all it is a political advertisement. That's all it is. Which gets us into the question that Mr. Tobin was asking. You know, are we spending too much on campaigns? I would agree with Senator Eagleton, and sure, they spend too much on political campaigns. I would doubt if the CPI, though, really relates to the cost that have been elevated by television and radio. And I think now...
Mac, let me ask you a question, because I think it'd be educational. Give me a rough guess. In 1986, that's your election year, how much of your time did you spend pursuing fundraising, either planning it, thinking about it, you know, getting set up to do it, going to the cocktail party or whatever the event was? Wasn't it if you can't put in a percent, wasn't it a very significant percentage of your time?
Yeah, it did, but I guess I'm lucky from the standpoint, I'm probably luckier from the standpoint that I decided that was not going to interfere with what I did in the United States Senate. Now, I guess I may be unique in that, I don't know. But, you know, as I said before, we worked half the time. We were off the other half. And but you're right, Tom, that, you know, every Monday night there are no votes after 6 o'clock. The reason why there's no votes after 6 o'clock on Monday night, guess why? So they can hold fundraisers up here. So you wouldn't have a vote. You know, I mean, I think that's, you know, I'd rather be working and voting. You know, as far as raising money, you know, people can raise the money for you.
Senator, thank you. Senator Scott, could you comment on public financing?
Yes, I served on a conference committee that lasted for weeks from the two houses on the creation of the Federal Elections Commission. And as most of you know, we did approve the public financing of presidential campaigns. What we did not approve, and I am one of those who thought we should have, was the public financing of the House and Senate campaigns. It was defeated for several reasons, but mostly fear. Fear by the Senate that the House members would be funded to run against them. Fear by the House members that they might not have that privilege or opportunity, and additional fear that it might fund some citizen in running against them. Well, none of those fears were very creditable, and if someone can think of some creditable motivation, I'd be glad to hear it. I waited 10 years for it. We were an odd couple. This was pressed chiefly by Senator Kennedy and myself. In the 5 or 6 weeks of conference, we were never able to get it through. If we had been, we could have put some limitation on it. The second thing that got away from us happened after I left the Senate in 1977, I believe, when the Congress added a new loophole authorizing the state committees to spend money for themselves in addition to what was allowed to be spent by candidates for federal office. That proved to be an enormous loophole. It was as wide as a barn door and as deep as a well, and advantage was taken of it. Now, not all of the fault was in the Congress. The Supreme Court managed to muddle the matter thoroughly in the case of Buckley against Vallejo. In that case, the Supreme Court struck out some of the work we had done and then went ahead to affirm something else. They struck out the best part and they affirmed the worst part, which is not unusual for the Supreme Court. But they held this odd thing that this Congress could put no limitation on any candidate for the federal office of House or Senate using his own money as much as he wanted and without having to account for it other than to report it. That meant that a man with $10 million or $40 million, and there are millionaires in the Senate and some are not, but it meant that anyone with a fortune of $10 or $100 million could spend as much of his money as he wanted on himself, where his opponent, who didn't have the $1 million estate or whatever it was, couldn't. Now, the Supreme Court justified that by saying that the right to use your money is an aspect of free speech, which is a difficult way of saying money talks. It was a horrible decision. I hope someday it will be revoked. But notice that that's something the Senate can't cure. We have no way of protecting the less affluent person except through the present devices, which, as I say, are being substantially misused. I'll give you one illustration of the committee system that Senator Thurmond would remember. He was ranking member of Judiciary at that time, and Senator Eagleton was the chairman. One of the senators from a western state pressed at each of our meetings for the creation of a new committee. I think he wanted to call it Subcommittee on Legislative Progress, or some other thoroughly innocuous but all-embracing title, in case he thought of something else. Finally, the chairman, Senator Eagleton, said to the senator, "Why do you want a subcommittee? Why do you bring this up every meeting?" And he said plaintively, "Because I'm the only member of the majority that isn't chairman of a subcommittee." So you see, there are all kinds of factors that motivate here. But basically, I commend Ellen Miller for the Committee on Constructive Politics. But it takes a tremendous amount of public pressure to bring that about.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Senator Eagleton, would you comment on the free television aspect of the Senate and House elections, and also the fact that spending is going crazy? For instance, in the Carolinas recently, there was $25 million spent on one race, which seems in a relatively low population state to be very high. Could you comment on that, please?
First, let me say that I think Senator Scott's exposition of the history and evolution of the Federal Election Reform Act and what ensued thereafter, including the Supreme Court decision, was an absolutely fabulous primer. I'm going to be a professor, so to speak, when I leave this body, and I think I'll have that lifted. I think in about 3 or 5 minutes, whatever it was, he gave a classic summary of just what the situation was. I disagree in one little respect, and I'll address that, but I think he set it out very skillfully. And I agree with him, money talks, and that's what the Supreme Court did say in essence, if not in words, in Buckley versus Vallejo. Sadly, the Supreme Court said it, but they said it. Where I would disagree with you, Hugh, in one respect, is that you said the Senate can't cure the problem. I think the Senate and the House can cure the problem. And I would submit that we can cure it with what is called either the Wisconsin or the New Jersey system. In Wisconsin and New Jersey, if you run for governor, there's public financing for your campaign. If the person on the other ticket refuses to abide by the strictures of public financing, which puts limits, we'll get $2 million or whatever it is, in New Jersey, maybe $1.5 million, Wisconsin. If you just say, no, I don't want to play under those rules. I may be a very, very wealthy individual, or I know a lot of wealthy individuals. Your opponent gets your money, puts a heck of a premium, or let's call it an inducement, to play by the rules. And if my recollection serves me correctly, in neither Wisconsin or New Jersey has a candidate for governor ever opted out of the system because he feared, well, my God, that'll double the other guy's kitty, free of charge. So we could set up a system here of matching federal funds, campaign spending limits, let's say $250, or if you think that's too chintzy in this day and age, let's say $500, to be matched by federal funds with a cap per size of state. Senator Scott's from Pennsylvania. Obviously, he'd have a bigger amount of money to spend in Pennsylvania. I'm from Missouri, which maybe Georgia's, I think, perhaps bigger than Missouri. But if you're in Delaware, obviously, a much smaller amount. So you'd have limits on the amount that any one contributor can give, overall spending limits. And then if the opponent on the other side didn't want to play according to those rules, you double it. You just give the other guy his pot of money. And that would satisfy Buckley versus Vallejo. All kinds of constitutional experts have said that. And I think that's at least one way of exploring it. I must say, that the Federal Election Commission, that's the thing we set up under the Federal Election Reform Act, and I was a participant in that act. I think it's the worst hoax in a political nature that Congress has inflicted on the people during my tenure here, and I'm sad to say I was part of that hoax, unknowingly, unwittingly. I didn't think it was going to end up the way it did, but I'm embarrassed. I'm ashamed. And the Federal Election Commission that tries to implement this act is the biggest joke in town. It is singularly the biggest joke in town. Think of any agency you don't like. Some people don't like OSHA, some people don't like EPA, some people don't like the Interstate Commerce Commission. Think of any agency you don't like, the Federal Election Commission is worse. So get a new list of don't likes, put that at top. They're clowns, they're inept, they're buffoons, they have no understanding of the law, and it's a mess. Now, what was your question, Maury?
I was going to say, do you mind if I put as my favorite choice of the worst agency in immigration and naturalization? They take a certain pride in being the worst, and I don't want to disappoint them.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, Senator Madigan.
I guess this is criticism day. Let me just say that as far as public financing, I'm not an advocate of public financing at all. I think I don't know how many people in here contributed the check off to the presidential election. I've never been able to figure that out yet, that when I check that, does half of it go to my candidate or all of it go to my candidate? Or it's only, they divvy it up half and half. I've never been quite an advocate of that. But I think, that we have to look and see, does the system really work in our country right now? Now, I mean, there's always going to be criticism, no matter what it is, sitting out there. When I ran in 1980, I wish I had the money that my opponent had. He probably outspent me 4-1, but I still beat him. And this time, I raised more than my opponent, and he beat me. So to say that maybe that the system doesn't work, I think it really, in fact, it does work. That certain things that come along in life make some dramatic changes. I think Watergate made some dramatic changes. And I think they were pluses as far as for trying to keep track of campaign contribution, whether or not we like the FEC or whether we don't. If I had my way, I would have full disclosure for everybody that are elected. They don't do that. They put it in trust and they say, that's not mine, that belongs to somebody else. So I think full disclosure would help for the people of our country to see really what their elected representatives really have. I also think that really full disclosure in reporting the campaign contributions. I don't believe you had to report of anything below $100. We've always reported everything in our campaign, even below $100. That I in fact think that's is the way to operate. Now, Mr. Tobin made the comment about free Senate TV. I'm not certain whether you mean the one that we got where we're televising the Senate. We haven't been able to find a subscriber to that yet. Even
I think this is the campaign.
But the campaign, like from either the Republican conference or the Democrat conference, about how they use the satellites and farm them out. I don't know. I was an opponent of televising the Senate, so I guess I'm not a real good person to ask about even, the utilizing of the TV. But there is a clamor from back home that they know that there is TV out there. You do the same thing with radio. You try to do the same thing with press releases. And I can't give you an honest answer to it, really, to say whether it is good or bad. I think a lot of these things sort of have to shake themselves out as time goes on. But that's